And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis looking something like this. Starting to make a slow advance back to the south and southeast here. Still quite a ways from St. Paul Island though. And over the next 5 to 7 days should make a little more faster advance here to the south and southwest as another shot of cold air comes down from the north. And in towards, for tonight's weather, clear and cold up Brooks Range to the Arctic coast. Clouds with areas of light snow, especially in the central interior. Tonight, a weak system with more light snow, southwest coast, Bristol Bay, Alaska Peninsula. It stays wet over the panhandle. And for tomorrow, this next low increases the wind and rain, southern southeast coast, and to a lesser extent in the north. But still enough moisture up here for a chance of some precipitation, cloudy skies across, precipitation along the coast, cloudy over most of southern Alaska, dry over the interior though, and storm force winds and gales come in with this next system out over the western Aleutians. And on Friday, intense storm there brings storm force winds to Chimay-Attu to about Kiska Island. But the front is extending eastward. There's a low kind of just hangs back there. This will really weaken and spread some light snow into the eastern Aleutians. Northern eastern Bering Sea, colder under northeast winds and dry conditions into the western interior. Central interior, variably cloudy with light winds, chance of snow on the east side. Low pressure in the eastern Gulf of Alaska pushes another front into the panhandle for more gusty winds and precipitation. And for the coastal water forecast on the south coast tomorrow, with that next front pushing up, we've got gale warnings, southeast 35 knots, gust to 50 knots, and east-southeast 20 to 25 knots on the central coast and the north coast, east to southeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Lynn Canal southeasterlies at 15 knots, about 20 knots from the southeast for Stevens Passage, and 30 knots for Clarence Strait with 10-foot seas. For the outlook on Friday, gale warnings, central and south coast, south to southeast winds 40 knots. North coast, east-northeast winds 20 to 40 knots, and Lynn Canal south at 25, south 30 for Stevens Passage, and Clarence Strait, south winds at 25 knots. And moving on to Prince William Sound, northeasterlies at 10 knots for Thursday, and the North Gulf Coast to the Barren Islands, northeast 20 knots, north 20 knots for southern Cook Inlet and Kamishak Bay, and just light northeasterlies at 10 knots for northern Cook Inlet. For Friday, variable winds for Cook Inlet at about 10 knots, northwest 25 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, north 15 for the western North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, northeast winds at 10 knots, eastern North Gulf Coast, east to northeasterlies at 15 to 20 knots, seas running about 8 to 10 feet. Kodiak Island, northerlies at 15 knots tomorrow, 2 to 5 foot seas. Alaska Peninsula northwest, 20 to 25 knots, seas up to 10 feet, and Bristol Bay northeast at 15. And then for Friday, variable winds here for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula at about 10 knots. On the Pacific side, north to northwest at 15 knots, Bristol Bay northwest at 10, and Kodiak Island, west to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, northwest winds 20 to 30 knots. And variable winds at 25 knots here for Adak and Atka. Maybe less than that though. And then good storms coming in from Kiska to Shemya, southeast, sustained 50 knots. And for Friday, west-southwest winds here with that intense low center just north of the western Aleutians. So west-southwest winds 45 to 55 knots. Amchitka Island, southwest 40 to 45 knots, and Adak and Atka, west-southwest 30 to 35 knots, and those winds continue to diminish as you head east on Alaska Island, looking at small craft advisories for east winds at 25 knots. For the southwest coast here, north winds 20 to 25 knots for Thursday, north 25 for St. Lawrence Island, and about 15 knots for Norton Sound. And for St. Matthew Island, north at 20, Pribilofs, northwest 25 knots. And for St. Paul and St. George, Friday, east at 20, northeast 30, St. Matthew Island, St. Lawrence Island, and the southwest coast, all north at 15 knots. Norton Sound, a little windier at 20 knots from the north. And for the central Arctic coast tomorrow, light winds out of the north at 5 knots, east side there, west at 10. Brisk wind advisories though for the western Arctic coast, northeast 25 to 30 knots, and brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea for north winds at 25 knots. And then for Friday, the Chukchi Sea, north winds at 20 knots there. Western and central Arctic coast, light west winds at 10 knots and west-southwest winds at 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.